Time is fleeting, dear viewer. Welcome to another astonishing episode of Roll of a Tangent, where Anthony Simeone, Robert Gibson, XJ, and I, Nikita Z, look at fabulous tales of yesterdays. Tonight we are covering The Garden of Forking Paths. This tale, written by a name that I will probably butcher, Jorge Luis Borges, or Borges, I'm not sure, in 1941, asks many a question. What is time? How many variations of it exists at the same exact moment? What is loyalty? Why do we choose to do the things we do? What value does a single life hold in an infinite multiverse? The tale is written in a first person perspective, where we follow the maniac mind of one Yu Tsun, a Chinese professor who is a spy. What are his motivations? What does he desire and why? One can only find out if they venture into the garden of the forking paths. Yeah, it's a very interesting tale, written not so long ago, but at the same time, it does feel like it is within the zeitgeist of the current mania for the idea of multiple universes and media. So I thought it appropriate to revisit this old and interesting tale and to see what we as now modern readers think about it. Uh, let's go around the table and see what everyone thought. XJ, how did you feel about this tale?
Um, I had some difficulty getting into the story actually, but it has nothing to do with the concept of the story. It
Hmm.
is it's a little bit like watching Firefly. Uh, and when I first watched Firefly, I like the setting and everything. And then they got to a point where they started talking in what I thought was an alien language, and I thought originally that was so brilliant of them that they would go through all that trouble to craft like a alien language and make it sound like so probable and stuff. And I was very, very impressed until I learned what they are actually trying to say was Mandarin. And I was like, oh. I mean, it was so badly pronounced that I thought it was an alien language. Uh, and it was that moment that took me out of the show. And I'm gonna have to say that this is the same thing. Like, it's very difficult to focus on the story when my mind was fighting the
Inaccuracies?
I wouldn't say inaccuracies, but it's more like it's just a very alien perspective on Chinese culture, I suppose. There
On
are
outsider's view.
an
Yeah.
outsider's view, and so it was like like one of the things that he that goes on in the story later on is he compared there was this guy that he found, Stephen Albert, I think the name was, talking about the book that his ancestor, the ancestor of and here's another thing, right? Like, I'm reading this the pinyin names of all these people, and I'm like, is it Yu Sen or Yu Sun or what is this? Right? And he they Stephen, I think it's Stephen Albert that was talking about the book his ancestors wrote, and then he was comparing it to Hong Lou Meng, which is a really, really big Chinese classic, like celebrated classic. And then they further go on to say that novelists in Chinese culture is looked down on, and I'm like, are you sure? Uh,
I just imagine that gif with John Cena where he comes out of a wall and he's like, "Are you sure about that?"
yeah, are you sure about that? Like, honestly, like,
Yeah.
and you know, like, 西游记, which is Journey to the West, that has no philosophical meandering about it that I can recall. It's just straight up a monster of the week. And I'm sorry, guys, but we invented the monster of the week formula.
I'm sorry, you never read Hercules and the 12 Labors?
Yeah, I mean, it was like I'm like, the Journey to the West is like a straight up just like an entertainment story, and there's a whole bunch of other things like Liao Zai and all that. And I was like, are you sure about novelists being like looked down on? And then uh, there was another one, the really odd one about a Taoist monk, priest and a monk being the executor of the estate of the governor, which is this guy's great granddad. And I was like, since when do I really don't know that the Chinese people would hand things over to a Taoist monk to execute our estate? But maybe I was wrong, you know. And just like little things like this that just takes me out of the story. Like I can't focus on it. And but beyond that, like the concept of time itself as a multi-branching path where different versions of ourselves sits in different universes and all that. This idea of the multiverse thing is probably not a philosophical concept that Chinese have, or at least I'm not familiar with it. So the whole thing just read like it just read really odd. It felt like the author thought it would be a neat idea to have this as some sort of Eastern mysticism thingamajiggy, and then just sort of wove a tale around it. And I'm wondering if the concept in 1941, which is, I think it was written in 1941, am I right?
Yes, correct.
Yeah, so it made me wonder if in 1941 this idea of multiverse is so outlandish that it felt better as Eastern mysticism than it does in like Enlightenment hypothesis, like what would the term be? Theoretical physics. Yes. Maybe theoretical physics wasn't even an invented thing back in 1941. So that was what I was thinking. So it had to be couched in terms of that. But going back to the question that Nikki asked me before I went on the tangent, is how does this multiverse idea strike me as a person in 2024? I'm gonna have to say that I really like the romanticism of different multiverse of a me who might have been. And there were a lot of shows from the 80s that I really liked, Sliders being one of those that explored the idea. And then Quantum Leap. I mean, those I really love those shows. I think though that lately I've been watching, like I watch a few shows with a different take on time traveling, like Steins Gate, which is an anime, and it had a very, very bleak view of time traveling, where when you travel to the past, that's your future. So you never really change the past. You can't change the past. What came before stays. I find that's a very bleak. I don't know why, but it's very melancholic, very bleak, but it appeals to me. Maybe I just have a really dark personality, I suppose. Yeah. All right. Well, someone else take over.
Yeah,
Mm,
Robert, what about you? What did you think
Just to
of the
pick up
story?
on XJ's point, I wasn't going to say anything about this myself because I hadn't thought of the points he's made. But since he's made them, it occurs to me that Chinese culture might deserve credit not only for being what it actually was, but for all the illusory ideas that other people have had of it. So, in fact, it starts getting multiplied into lots of different imaginary cultures. After I can imagine a Japanese person watching the Gilbert and Sullivan opera, The Mikado, and thinking, blimey, whatever the Japanese for blimey is, this is nothing like Japan. It's got nothing to do with it. But you could say, well, Japan is multiplying itself into other. It's like a forking path actually into lots of different
Huh.
cultures. And of course, you get the phenomenon of Western movies that are about nothing whatsoever like what things really were like, or so they say. I don't suppose that the Magnificent Seven and High Noon and all that correspond to much in reality. Anyway, all that to the side. What did I think of the story? It's decades since I read it, and the first time I remember from the first time just the denouement, the shooting, and the fact that the shooting was the message. That's all I remembered from it. I hadn't remembered all about the labyrinth idea and the multi probability time web idea. And having reread it, I at first thought it was perhaps a flaw in the story in that the multi time web, multi probability web idea doesn't actually seem to link up with the conclusion of the story, the use of a murder as a message. But thinking about it some more, I realized, or to me anyway, that um, the contrast between the philosophical build-up and the very violent ending is perhaps the point, part of the point of the story. Is not a defect at all. It's making the point that build-ups and denouements often are unguessably different. And after all, that's reflected in the fact that one of the themes of the story is how difficult it is to guess at, at backgrounds and motives. The reason for the military delay mentioned in the first paragraph is obviously unknown to military historians. The reason for killing Stephen Albert is unknown except for by the person who did it. The reason for him being a spy was hard to guess because he didn't like the Germans and yet he was spying on them. It was to prove that a yellow man could save their armies. Madden's motive for pursuing the spy is partly because he was an Irishman and his loyalty was in doubt and he had to prove it. So it's the whole thing is a tissue of misleading events, and that's, I suppose, the climax fits in well with that. So yeah, I like the story, and a typical Borges experience of the idea being the hero rather than any actual character being the hero. It's the title of the book that I got this from, Labyrinths, is appropriate. So I'd give it high marks, very high marks.
Nice. What about you, Anthony? What did you think of the story?
I think I've been reading way too much sword and sorcery lately and other sort of pretty straightforward narratives. It was kind of a different sort of shocking experience just to my reading sensibilities, I think, currently, to read a story that was a little more, you had to be a little more cerebral in the reading of it. It, I've been meaning to read Borges, and, I've never really dived into those authors that are like him, I would say, and in the magical realism sort of way. I think Borges is in that general genre, if you can call it a genre, of magical realism, like Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and there's an Italian author I think that I'm missing there. I forget his name, but there's this,
You know,
especially I it seems like the early 20th century was like they were good for magical realism. So I think Marquez wrote a story about like just an old man with wings wound up in someone's backyard. I think I read that story years ago, but it's just like, and it's in this story, I had the same feeling. It's like this idea of multiverse or forking paths of circumstance and how that happens. I mean, quantum mechanics was around from the in some nascent way in the early 1900s, I believe, but it's like this compared to sliders. I think XJ, you were talking about sliders at some point earlier in the conversation, right? Or but maybe even before we started recording. But this is not sliders. I mean, this is a very subtle exploration, in 1941, in the early 20 or early to almost mid 20th century, of this concept of, multiple forking paths of time and reality. It definitely feels like it might have colored authors like Roger Zelazny, who I'm a big fan of, with his. And it's interesting, Robert, that you just held up the book, and the name of the book is Labyrinths, because in Zelazny's stories, there's a force or an actual talisman, a giant talisman called the Pattern, that one of like the main character's forebears inscribed, that you traverse it and you become a master of the ability to travel through universes and walk and subtly shift reality to your whims. So this definitely, the story got me thinking. I don't know how much I liked it in terms of the story that was framed around it. And it definitely was idea driven more than it was character driven. Like you said, Robert, I mean, that was the hit the nail on the head. The concept, or the hero, versus the characters are sort of just at its whim. Uh, but yeah, the narrative I didn't quite follow that well, but I guess I'm like, okay, this is maybe too subtle right now for my reading sensibilities or my reading mood. I don't know if you guys ever get into these reading moods or reading temperatures, I call them, for myself, but it's just like I don't know if like I'm in the mindset to read a story that's this subtle right now, it seemed to me. Um, so I'm not quite sure about the crafting of the story around it, but just treating the subject of multiple branching possibilities in your reality expressed in a subtle way that wasn't like sliders, like, oh look, we're going to another time or another alternate reality through like this corny looking wormhole that's bad CGI. It's that So I appreciated the subtlety of it. I appreciate it. Yeah, I don't know if I quite like the way he got there, but again, that's something that I always felt like I wanted to read more of, that sort of genre. Like I said, like these magical realists, where it's like a man with wings will fall into your backyard, and everyone just kind of treats it as sort of quirky, but not like they're not running around screaming and going, "Oh my God, the world is ending. Why is there a man with wings?" It's more like, okay, that's interesting, and it kind of like they bleed. Like the way the characters react is not how someone in the real world will react to like oddities like that. So it's like they kind of I always admired that sort of subtlety. I definitely feel like I personally, as a reader and a writer, want to delve more into that. So this sort of got my juices flowing about this type of work, but I don't know if I like the story itself. But again, like 1941, this was written, probably one of the first examples of this sort of being explored, and it was done in a subtle way that I admire and wish I could emulate and hope to maybe someday. But yeah, I don't know how much I got out of the story entertainment wise. But again, like I said, I've been reading way too much action, heroic fantasy, sword and sorcery kind of stuff lately. So maybe I'm just not in that mindset to appreciate it as much. But anyway, what
You know,
about you,
it's
Nikki?
kind of funny because um,
Oh,
I just came to a realization while you're doing your giving us your take, Anthony, and that is we don't actually see anything magical about the story, did we? Like there was no time traveling. It was all explaining the concept, but everything that happened in the story itself was pretty much a straightforward linear thing that started from him running to him ending at Albert's estate shooting the guy and then getting captured. It's just like there's nothing in between. It was just talking about the story, about the concept of multiple branching paths, universal paths, and then but there's nothing really science fictiony that happened in
Yeah.
the story
And
itself.
I
And
Yeah, and I feel like this yeah, I feel like this is the kind of story that many people would read that aren't into the art of writing and reading and go, What did I just read? What the hell just happened? Like what happened?" And but it's so I feel like and again, that's not like a pomposity thing. It's just that some people are more into the art and the craft. I feel like this is like a writer's story or to be read by someone who's into the craft. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong there. Obviously, Borges was a huge figure in South American literature in general, and I think he was Colombian, right? But um, yeah, I mean, it's like he's revered, but it's like, yeah, I don't by like obviously more than just writers. He gained pretty wide acclaim, or maybe I could be wrong, but um, yeah. So I don't know. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but that kind of just spurred like a thought on my head. But yeah, like it feels like this is like to really appreciate it, you kind of need to be someone who's into subtle writing and not really like too much action in some of your stories. Like I don't know.
I really enjoyed the story. I think that it has a lot of potential, and it is the type of tale, although it is, I would say, harder to read the first time, uh, is worth of several readings. I mean, little things start jumping out at you when you know the ending and how it's all gonna go. I mean, just as an example, in the very first part of the story, our protagonist thinks about an individual, someone that he wants to reach in some way, and he says, "A man who, sitting in his arid Berlin office, leafed infinitely through newspapers, looking in vain for news from us." And then the ending, right, describes that the entire thing that our protagonist did in the story was then later reported in a newspaper, and that's how the um, officers found out exactly which town to be aware of during the First World War in that particular period. And that was, you know, that was one of the more less subtle parts of callbacks in the story, but there's plenty of others. And to me, at the very least, now I'm not saying that this is what the writer intended, but this is what I got out of it. The discussion about the multi universe as a whole and what it means um, is also gnawing at the soul of the protagonist as they're having that discussion. Because to him, it's more about he hasn't done what he came here to do yet. So all universes are open, all possibilities are still there. And as he's listening to the story, you know, the one who's telling it, Albert, he's like, in one universe, you and I have never met. In one of them, you are my friend, and in another, you are my enemy. And what Albert doesn't realize is that he's in a universe where they're enemies, and he's about to die, right? And there's something so cool about that. Um, yeah, it's just I feel like this is not a story that you could sit down and relax and enjoy. this is more of a study, something that you'd look at from the perspective of an academic eye, an academic view, where you could pick it apart and see where it goes and why it's trying to do the things it does. And when you do see those little blemishes, or the subtler callbacks, or the story pushing a certain thing in front of you, and you being blind to it because it's your first reading and you don't really get it until you uh, have it all in your hands completely, and revisiting it becomes rewarding. Yeah, it's not a story that would impress me when I was younger. Definitely, I would probably leave after this story, and I'd be like, yeah. I mean, all of that talk about the labyrinth was cool, but we never got to see the labyrinth, and nobody came out of a multiverse. So, what was the point? I mean, what are we doing here? I only have this much time on planet Earth. Like, get to the point. But now, as an older man, I realize that the twist, the shock of it all, is just one little piece of the story. And why I really like the ending, because it does come out of nowhere for a person who has been droned into, like, okay, we're talking about, like the universes, and we're talking about the ancestors and blah 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 blah, and then it just suddenly switches back to, like, okay, but here's what's actually happening in the real world. The guy's dead, and you're like, oh damn, right? Um, that's just one aspect that's really good about it. Which I too enjoy. I'm not saying I didn't enjoy the ending or anything like that. Um, you have to also consider that this was written during World War II, 1941. So it it has this strange melancholic feel to it, right? Writing about a previous war during the current one. I wonder why uh, that was done. Why did the author decide to tell this tale in such a way? But yeah, I really enjoyed it. I think that if one tried to make it better, like I usually do with stories that I didn't 100% enjoy, right? Like, there's still some things that I think could have been done better. I struggle to actually say what I would change, because it feels to me that all of the little details in the story are so deliberate, and perhaps where even in the parts where I myself don't see any meaning, perhaps if someone more scholarly looked at it and told me, well, obviously paragraph 27 is connected to the third one, that's why you can't take it out, and I'd be like, oh right, like, maybe I'm just not seeing it, maybe I'm not genius enough. But it really feels like someone who um crafted the story to be exactly how it should be. I did find, as a non-native speaker, uh, that the translation of the story was a bit harder to read. This does come from Spanish. It was originally written in Spanish. It's not an Englishly native written tale, so I'm sure it reads better in its native language. But yeah, the translation that I was reading, it had a lot of archaic words that I had to look up. I didn't know them, didn't know what they meant. So that kind of slowed me down. But otherwise, yeah, it was a good time. No alcohol required.
Mm.
Yeah.
Interesting what you said about the translation, Nikki, that actually Borges himself is on record as not thinking very highly of his own language. He once said, "You can't say anything in Spanish." He was he much admired the vaster vocabulary of the English language, though he did write in Spanish. But it's because the poor guy couldn't help it.
Fair enough.
Anyway.
That's funny. But I did find this English translation a bit rough around the edges.
Mm. I find it very easy. What I find hard are stories written nowadays, which are written in a kind of jerky style, where one sentence plonks onto this page, and then another sentence plonks onto the page, and every other sentence has the F word in it, and so on. And I get really depressed. But this I I was quite happy with.
Yeah, I'm not comparing it to modern writing in any way, shape, or form. It's just I personally found it difficult.
Mm.
Can't speak for anyone else. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of interesting calls towards the theory of infinite dimensions and infinite realities in this, um, and I do think that um, it would benefit from not talking about it abstractly all the time, but also being like, look, just for you folks who are here to really think about this, right? There could have been a moment where Albert does a whole paragraph where he gives an example of a person's life and how it could change just because of a single thing that happened to them, right? Like the butterfly effect, if something like that was explained or showcased in the story, I think it would land even better. But yeah, I'm not sure. Um, if I'm just not trying to improve something for the sake of simply changing things.
Yeah, it's almost like that would take the wonder out of things. If it was explained too much, it would take the wonder out of it and the magic out of it. And it's almost like I feel like the way he described it, things like this, that could happen to anyone at any time. Like that, it puts a little wonder and mystery into the world. I feel like the way so it's sort of like describing how it actually might really happen. I don't know if someone's in a subtle way where maybe you just wander into a labyrinth of some sort, like a hedge maze or something, and you just wind up with a different branching path of your life or something, or you're able to kind of skip back and come back out in a time maybe a few hours before where you were before you entered the labyrinth. I don't know, and it's just something that, that's just happened. It's you're there, nothing dramatic, nothing obvious about it, so it's more subtle than anything else, so it's makes it almost seem more possible maybe to my mind. I don't know, it's so I'm of two minds too, because yeah, we live, decades later, where this idea of now it's a talking point of like rich, wacky billionaires and science fiction nerds, who are like talking about, the multiple worlds theory and parallel worlds. Now it's such a overdone concept almost in science fiction and in real world science is exploring it. So it's like, again, I always struggle with these stories that we're reading from the early 20th century where this was a new idea to them and a new concept and something they wanted to explore. But now it's like, we've seen this kind of thing done to death and in much less subtle ways. So now it's almost we're like, okay, we kind of know this, like I guess Man in the High Castle also came to mind when I was reading this. And that kind of culminated. That was sort of subtle at first, but then like just watching the show, I haven't read the book in a long time, but I watched the show that they based off of the book. And okay, that came down to like, okay, here's the portal, and we're gonna turn it on now, and you walk through. So, and that was like, okay, now it's like too obvious. But here in this story, it's like it's not just, they mentioned this labyrinth, but like you said, I mean, they don't really show it. It's kind of just explained.
The
So
thing is, I
it's
wonder if Borges himself even think that the Garden of Forking Paths is a thing, like this multi-universe concept is a thing, because
right.
it's going to be difficult for me to explain what I'm thinking. But the example chapter that Stephen Albert was narrating to the protagonist, you notice it's about two armies winning a battle, And you notice that in one version it was they passed through a place with a great banquet, so their morale was super uplifted, and then they won the battle. In the other version, um, the conditions were so bleak that they were like it's do or die, and they won the battle anyway. And it's like at that point I was like, when I remember reading it, and I was like, what is it that what is it that the writer was trying to illustrate here? Like is
Yeah.
he really illustrating a universe of multiple possibilities, or is he more like more in line with it doesn't matter what you do, the outcome is all the same anyway.
That's what I was trying to say with
And
my example. That the example has to be like solid, because that kind of felt like just an out of nowhere quote. I completely agree with you, actually. But
yeah,
please continue.
and like the thing is right after that, right, there was one paragraph, and I was looking away from my camera just to find that particular paragraph. It just came right after Stephen Albert was narrating the chapter of the two armies, right? And it was at that moment I felt within me and around me something invisible and intangible pullulating. I had not heard of that word before. So hats off to you, Nikki. It was not the pullulation of two divergent, parallel, and finally converging armies, but an agitation more inaccessible, more intimate, prefigured by them in some way. Stephen Albert continued. And I was like, okay, what the hell is this? Like, are you saying like something is that's like the moment of focus, like the moment of destiny when everything turns and everything is like converging, and this is the decision point, and he ends up killing Stephen Albert anyway. Is that what Borges is driving at? And I was like, so what is Borges really saying here? Like, it doesn't matter what you do, everything is going to turn out the same anyway. Or really, there is really a universe of possibilities. Well, that was what I thought when I was reading it anyway.
I think you've got a
Yeah, or
different translation from mine, actually, XJ. There isn't any pullulating in mine.
Really?
It's swarming. Yeah.
Oh,
yeah, or
well,
is this whole story just about your actions have consequences? I don't know. Or like, and if wouldn't it be great if we could play with those and take things back? Or like, so the age old, like, hey, what if, coulda, shoulda, woulda, what if I had done things differently in my life and just regret and everything? And I don't know. So it's also works on that level, maybe. So yeah, I don't know. It's a lot too that we can get a lot. I definitely feel like I need to read this again. To your point, Nikki, but because this was the first time I've read it, so definitely need to go back and read it again now, knowing what I know now, and just maybe to pick out some things, clues along the way.
Hmm.
yeah, this is probably a story that deserves a second reading. Although it's,
For sure.
although again, like on a personal level, it was a very difficult story for me to get into. But it just kept throwing me off. Like I just kept being taken out of the story just because of the unfortunate choice of setting it on a character who is Chinese.
Yeah, I mean, it was
Yeah,
hard
I'm
for
very
me.
disappointed. I'm very disappointed to hear, by the way, that it was just so misrepresentative.
I
Kinda
don't know if
sad.
it's misrepresented, as in like it's like coming in from a perspective that is so different that I have to really take myself out and put myself in Borges' shoes to see it. If you know what I mean, is that sometimes people have, like, outsiders have a see things that me being steeped in won't see. It's like this that concept in psychology. I think it's called Johari's window. you know, where there's the guy that will see things that you don't see, and it to me it's just difficult to wrap my head around. And like,
Yeah. And maybe you had a point earlier about that. I guess, I mean, you're talking early 20th century, so there was such a thing as, I mean, and again, I'm not a huge devotee of like cultural appropriation. I mean, but it does happen. And there was this, I think, an era of Orientalism, I think they called, where it was like, okay, well, yes, it's the East, it's mystical. I mean, that persisted up to like the 1970s, 80s, where it was like, oh, the secrets of the East and, getting things from China and, and for Westerners, it it was appropriation, and it was like, oh, we really don't understand your culture in the Far East, so we're going to make it mystical. And so I mean, but so I think people in the West have done that
I
to
think
our detriment
to be
for a long
fair,
time, but
the
I don't
closest feeling is probably when a native English speaker hears a Japanese song that has English words littered into it, and then you go like, that's not how we really use that particular word, that sort of feeling.
right. Yeah, yeah. No, yeah, I totally get it. So yeah, good point.
It
That's a
was
good
just
example.
it was just like a shift, like the shift in perspective required to get into the story was just too great for me.
Yeah, but I mean, yeah, on one level it's like, hey, did he just we don't know his motivations, but it's like, yeah, did he just make it that it was created by a Chinese man who is sort of mystic because, oh, it's mysterious over there. So, and this is a mysterious concept. So that's the lazy way to kind of do tapping into someone's culture. But if you actually like studied their culture and then wrote something about it, it would be less like, you'd probably be less inclined to be like, oh, this part of the world is magical because we don't understand it. So I don't know. It's yeah. So, but different times, right?
Hmm.
Any other thoughts, maybe from you, Robert? That you have over the story or the discussion so far?
Well, just that it happens all the time, and all over the world.
What people named Albert being shot? Oh,
Sorry, what
people
was it?
named Albert being shot happens all the time.
I mean, it happens all the time and all over the world that people uh, make legends out of cultures without knowing about them, and
Yeah.
and indeed about their own cultures as well. So
Yeah. I mean,
it's
at the end of the day, the decision usually is this sounded cool to me, so I used it and it was fun. I mean,
It's
just
nothing malicious.
look at the Japanese obsession with crosses in all their video games. The Christian crosses are just everywhere, and you're just like, okay, but
Yeah.
the the meaning of like what's going on here? Like, wow, it looks. I mean, look at this. Isn't this awesome? Isn't this like what's his name? The guy who made Evangelion. People were like asking him like, okay, so like, so is this about the God and the devil and the Christianity? Blah, blah. He was like, nah, man, crosses are awesome. That's why we have crosses.
Wait. But
Yeah,
the symbolism in Evangelion that Hideaki Anno used a lot though wasn't the cross though. It was that seraphic diagram thingamajiggy.
yeah.
And that
You're
was
right. You're
more
right.
that
I'm
has
just
more to do
yeah.
with Gnosticism, isn't it? And there's a lot of alchemical metaphysics behind that, I feel like. But I totally grok your meaning there, Nikki. Sometimes authors just slap things in because it looks cool.
I mean, I do it all the
Yeah.
time. I'm not gonna be like, all of these authors who don't do anything right, and then it's me who gets all the meanings of all the things he steals. Like no,
Yeah.
no, not at
But I
all.
mean, an example in my life as a writer was actually when I wrote a story set in World War I with a bunch of German characters, and I gave them German names. And Nikki, you read it, and you're like, well, you're kind of using all these names that are just like Smith or something. Like you're
Yeah,
the
yeah,
way you
yeah,
put it
yeah,
was
yeah.
like you told me like, okay, you're trying to write from a German's perspective, German soldier, which I'm not a German, and I was not around in that time period. So you're like, maybe change the names up because the names are kind of corny, like the surnames that I use. You're like, so I'm like, and I never thought of that. I'm like, okay, well, I called like, I used like Pfeiffer and Schmidt and some German names that I feel like are very stereotypical, like in film and media. So I was like, okay, I made a purposeful effort to kind of go in and change all of those names and be a little more, diverse versus like my own biases of like even just from naming conventions of naming characters. So that's an example of like someone like you who's more in touch with the culture that I'm trying to write about, you gave me a reading and said, these names are a little hackneyed. Like no one really would have all these names, or they're all kind of like maybe you can do a better job there. So it required me to go and dive a little deeper into that culture and that time period. So I
Yeah.
don't know. I
Yeah.
mean, we all have blind spots, and
Of
that's why it's
course,
good
of
to have
course.
other people from other
I mean,
cultures. Yeah.
if you asked me to write anything about Chinese individuals, Chinese people, God, man, I'd be roasted
Right.
like J.K. Rowling with her like
Right.
Dongo Noodle or whatever the name of the character was. Like,
What?
it's just like, what the hell?
Who?
It was something super racist. J.K. Rowling has like a
Oh,
weird
is that
kung pao chicken woman or something. I don't know. It was
chick
just very
is that
stupid.
chick that Harry Potter was supposed to have like a thing for at
Yeah.
one point? Okay,
J.K.
the
Rowling.
yuppie love thing. Oh, okay, I remember. I I don't
Anyway,
know.
but yeah.
Kung Pao chicken.
Oh yeah, it's Cho Chang.
That
Which- which-
that doesn't even sound Chinese as it sound Korean, to be quite honest.
Well, I think
Right.
she was the
That's
way
the
I
point.
feel it was. Okay, I'm not allegedly. All right. By the way, all the lawyers of J.K. Rowling, allegedly, this is my interpretation of how I believe it was. She was typing. She was like, China. What do I know about it? Like,
Throw a
Peking
couple
duck.
of
No,
pots,
that's too easy.
Throw a couple of pots
oh,
down the
oh.
staircase and pick up the sounds.
No, she was like,
Right.
no. To me, it sounds very deliberate. I think she was like, Ching Chong. Oh yeah, Cho Chang. That's the way it sounds to me.
Yeah,
Just
definitely.
read a Chinese
She just
Japanese
threw a
menu.
couple of pots down the staircase and picked up two sounds, right?
Right.
Yeah. But back to me. If I was in a similar situation where I was
Yeah.
writing about someone who is from a culture that is as alien to me as it could be, right? Like I'd love to know more about China, but the barrier of entry is just too great with the language.
I mean, you find it very. I do find it common. It's like even John Wick. That I think the last John Wick show, which I thoroughly enjoyed, but John Wick found himself in Tokyo at one point, I think, and it was so clear that Keanu Reeves does not speak Japanese because they tried to film him. They tried to film him at the rooftop talking to, I think, the guy's daughter or the guy himself, and he was trying to say a few Japanese words, and it's so clear that Keanu Reeves can't do it.
Yeah, it's the same with all the Russian in those movies. And look, he's called Baba Yaga, and that makes no sense. That makes less than 0 sense because Baba Yaga is a fictionally female character who isn't even about killing people. Okay, forget that she's a female character. She has nothing to do with like being the boogeyman. If you wanted to call him a boogeyman and make it sound Russian, you would call him Kashay. And Kashay is literally the necromancer of the Russian folklore. And he's the deathless. He literally cannot be killed. He's an unstoppable personification of death. It's right there, Hollywood. It's right there. Just take it. Why are you calling him Baba Yaga? What is wrong with you? Yeah.
Oh, well.
I remember being
Creativity.
very thrown off when I heard him being called Baba Yaga too, because being a D&D nerd, I kind of have I know about the house with chicken legs and all that stuff,
Yeah.
Same
and I
here.
was like, why
Same here.
Baba Yaga?
Well,
That's all I
how
was
does that
thinking
make
of, like,
any
the house with
sense?
chicken
Yeah.
legs. Well,
I mean, this
Seems like
this
we're
part
a
of the
little on a tangent.
conversation is more interesting to me, to be quite honest, than the story itself.
ooh,
Well, but it is born from the misappropriational use of the Chinese literature in it. It's somehow connected.
Honestly, I don't
Sure.
know. I don't know if I think Borges set the guy to be Chinese and then all this labyrinth stuff because he thought it was cool. I bet that was it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's I
more
support that
malicious than that.
full-heartedly. I
Yeah,
support
yeah,
that full-heartedly. It couldn't
I
be
was
anything
like,
else.
And I was like, yeah, you know what? That's fine with me. It's just that for me in particular, it was just like, oh my god, it's very hard to get into, unfortunately. But you know what? When you write a story, you can't please everybody. You know, it's not gonna strike everybody the same way.
Yeah.
And if you try to
mean, yeah,
please
there-
everyone, you end up pleasing nobody.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, man.
I don't
Wow.
know. Is it score time? Is it rating time?
I want to say one more thing. I would want to read more of this author's work, even though
Yeah.
I'm not a scholarly reader usually. I love my pew-pews, as we say on the show, and I mean the tolerance for pew-pews that I have, I think, is the highest on the podcast, because I want it to be literally in every sentence, like, and then he grabbed this skull and fucking ripped it apart, and then used those parts of the skull to fight the other people, and you're like, wow, that's the type of stuff I like. But you're like, okay, too much gore. So it's strange coming from me. But
Come on, Nikki.
yeah,
Pew pew is
Yeah.
not the same thing as just gore, okay?
All right. I think
Well-
you're thinking hack slash.
nah. I mean,
All right,
well,
maybe
okay,
that's-
when I
maybe
say
that's me.
pew pew, okay, hold on, maybe this is a misunderstanding. I thought pew pew means action.
Pew pew does
No,
mean
no,
action,
no.
but action is
Yeah, but I'm
huge
saying
coverage,
I
right?
want the action to be super over the top, right? I want it to be super. I want it to be so crazy that you're just sitting there and thinking, this is impossible, but this is the coolest thing I've ever read. If I actually got
Okay.
to see that.
Fair enough.
Gotcha.
It's a projectile. You have to have a projectile for pew.
There's that too. You need to have a projectile in order to
All
have
right,
a
well
pew pew.
then let's change my idea with he rips the skull in half and then he uses one of the parts as a boomerang. There you go.
Okay.
Sounds like hack slash to me. Hack and slash.
There's a projectile in it. All right, Anthony. I fulfilled
Okay.
the requirements.
Right. Jawbone as projectile.
Yeah.
Got- and boomerang.
Yeah,
There you go.
yeah. It's a plus
Jawbone
3 boomerang. All right,
Plus stream
Oh,
boomerang.
jawbone.
amazing. All right, yeah. I think
Sounds
it's
good.
score time now.
Who wants to go first?
I'll give it an 8 out of 10 because I was awake when I was reading it. But if I was looking for my pew pew fuel, I'd probably rate it a lot less.
I think I'm going 6.5. And that's propped up mostly by concept. Story, maybe if I read it again, my score will change. But for now, 6.5. Maybe on a second reading, I might increase that. But yeah, 6.5 for now.
Nice.
I will give it a 6. I don't. I wanted to like the story. I just couldn't get into it. It's probably for a different audience than me. So, I mean, I can see that the story itself is masterfully crafted. Just, I happen to be one of those that can't get into it. So 6.
So what was your score, XJ? I didn't hear the number.
6.
6. Oh, that's. Oh. Oh, well done.
I'm also surprised. I thought it would be way lower.
Oh really? Well, I mean,
Yeah.
honestly, the big drawback for me for this story is just the fact that I couldn't get into it for reasons.
That's
you know?
that's right. That's right. And that's why I thought it would be way lower, because I think that reason is not just substantial, but I think it's very how do I say this? I can relate to it wholeheartedly as a person who lives in a society who constantly uses references to Slavic stuff without ever understanding what the hell it's referencing.
That's fair. I mean, I'm trying to be fair to the story. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Well, yeah, I can see that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Robert, what's your score?
Yeah, I'll
10 out
give
of
it my
10?
usual full marks, I think, because well, it's about as far as you can get from a Warhammer story, which is um,
A great
Full
strategy.
pew pew.
and I think it's perfect of its kind. I'm not at all bothered about the cultural appropriation because
It's not your
we-
culture being appropriated.
we're constantly inventing everything. So what the heck, you know?
I mean, I don't think our problem is a cultural. Okay, at least I'm not gonna speak for XJ, but for me, the problem isn't the cultural appropriation. It's the fact that like there isn't enough research in there to make it interesting, uh, and actually transform it into something or understand it enough.
For me, it's Niki's example, Baba Yaga, was like the perfect example. Because when somebody calls someone a Baba Yaga, I am not expecting a John Wick killer. You know what I'm trying to say? It's like, it's like, it's like I have the conception of this particular thing, and then the author uses this thing to refer to something else, and then the rest of the time I'm fighting that perception that I have in my mind. So it's very hard to get immersed in the story. I'm not offended by what Borges did in the story. It's that I can't get into it because I keep trying to fight these two different visions that I have inside my mind. It's like, it's like, it's like if he had went and talked about Buddhism and then talked about Buddha as if he's the one God, from like a Christian perspective, and then I'll be like, that's not quite what Buddhism is, you know. And then the whole time with the story, I'm just like fighting the image, because when I first watched John Wick and heard him was caught that his nickname is the Baba Yaga, and I'm like, I just cannot square this cool killer demonic boogeyman figure with Baba Yaga, because Baba Yaga is, like Nikki said, is a completely different thing.
But is there anything in this story that's really that bad? That's really as inappropriate as that?
Again, it's not inappropriate. It's just like it's like seeing double visions. I'm really struggling to explain myself. I think it's like having double vision, and it just makes the reading very uncomfortable. It's like I'm trying to square what the guy is what Borges is writing about, and then it's fighting with the perspective that I have. Like the whole time, I'm not offended at all, if that's what you're getting at. It's just like it's difficult for me to get into because it's just like a completely different lens. It would have been a lot better if he had just like easier to get into if he had just used something else instead of Chinese. And even the names themselves, like when he used Sui Pen and Yu Sung, my first immediate instinct is to actually try to map out what the actual word is in Mandarin, and I could see what Yu Sung could be, but I cannot see what Sui Pen is. For instance, like Sui Pen, what pen?
Yeah. And like, did he mean something deeper by it? And if he did, he got it wrong, right? Like, is that what you're saying? Like, if he's trying to do a subtext with using that particular name or word, if he was, it would be the wrong.
The
thing
funny
to do.
thing is, I can't really find the part now. But he called. I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff like the Pavilion of the Limpid Sun, and I was like, what the hell is that? Like yeah, the third emperor of the Luminous Dynasty. Wow, that sounds really cool, but But it's totally not Chinese.
So it's all just made up.
Yeah, limpid is an antiquated word for like I think clarity or clear, like a clear something clear. Like usually it's described like a limpid pool of water. I think is like the only usage I ever like. A limpid pool of water is something that's clear and unclouded or unpolluted.
It's just that I don't ever recall, and this could just be that I don't know my own history well enough. Like, I don't know that we ever caught these dynasties with such names, titles like the Luminous Dynasty or the Pavilion of Limpid Sun.
Right, like, and that's like again, that's like yeah, that sounds like for a Western person, a naming convention in English of like an Asian place, or like a
Yeah,
Chinese place,
and
like
and it's like yes, okay, I found it. So he would say like the first line that Stephen Albert greeted Yu Tsun with was, "I see that the worthy Si Peng has troubled himself to see to relieving my solitude. No doubt you want to see the garden." And I'm like, Si Peng actually makes sense. But Sui Pen, is it Sui Pen that he's referring to actually? Like, Si Peng actually makes sense, but Sui Pen does not to me.
Yeah, like I think I read a fantasy story once that was Asian inspired, and I think the name of the emperor was what they called the emperor was the august personage of Jade. And I'm like, wow, I'm like that's really awkward sounding, but I mean that I think is stereotypically from like a Western perspective of something in the someone in the Far East, like a Chinese person would call someone in a feudal Chinese setting. You know what I mean? So I think that's ripe. I think fiction is ripe from a Western perspective with that sort of thing, where you have to give something a long and complicated name, just like a Native American
Glorious
person
sun
always
god of the Jade
right.
Empire.
The august personage of Jade, or like an Indian person always needs to be called stands with a fist, or eats with a fork. Like it's like that sort of stereotype where
I mean,
Rides at dusk.
I mean,
Right.
again, I just want to say
with wind in its
again,
hair.
I just want to stress that it's not that I find it offensive or anything. It's just very awkward. Very awkward. I think that's the best word to describe it. It's very awkward.
I'm disappointed. Whenever I see this, I'm also not a fan. I'm just like, man, there's Google now. I get 1941, my man, he actually wrote the names correctly, and he tried his best. I don't feel so upset about him. I kind of more feel upset about the modern stuff where it's like open your laptop, man. Like just Google like personification of death in Slavic folklore. Like, oh my god, something comes up that I could actually read in English.
Yeah, well, yeah, I guess so. But yeah, I mean, again, I want to stress, it's not that I'm offended that he put the thing in China and use like the perception of Chinese people at that time that was in that era, or even like the way that he used it himself. It was just a feeling of great dislocation. Like I just couldn't put myself into it.
Well, if Nikki, you were to Google Abdul al-Hazred's Necronomicon, you might be disappointed as well.
There's any English translations? Hey, that is fiction, and it's like it desires to be fiction. Here, it steeps itself in trying to be as realistic as possible. I get what you're trying to say, Robert, but I think it is a little bit different.
Well, this is fiction as well. It's just written in a very convincing style, but it's fiction.
Yeah.
Well,
All right. You know what? I think Robert has a good point. But I swear, if I read a short story where you call a killer Baba Yaga, you're out. You're out, Robert. I'm coming to your town.
Yeah. Well, that is a crude mistake, though. Much cruder than.
Yeah, for sure.
Mhm.
I agree. Yeah, Anthony, I'm sorry. Did you give a score as well already?
Yeah, 6.5. Yeah, so I was a
6.5 was
little
yours.
above.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, XJ score.
Right. Wow. Well, I mean, I don't take Roberts into account, so I think I have the most positive score. I mean, look, if you always give the same number, it becomes meaningless.
Well, that's because we've talked about some very good stories, which
Oh,
I
I
couldn't
mean, to be
see.
got
fair,
out.
Robert no longer
Yeah.
gives 11 out of 10.
That's true. I I think the one story that we all scored really low was before your time, Anthony. It was the snows of Kilimanjaro.
That is
Yeah, you
unanimous.
guys
We-
keep talking about
Unanimous.
that.
Yeah,
I
it was
think that was the first time it was a unanimous score. Boom.
That's right. We all agreed on just how terrible it was. You should watch that episode when you have time, just in the
Yeah,
car
sure.
going somewhere.
I need to go back and
It's
watch that. Yeah.
like the amount of like nonchalant British passive aggressiveness that comes from Robert, and that he's just like, well, I did think that this was rather sad coming from someone who is thought to be as an author, or something like that. I was just like, oh.
Ow, burn.
Call an ambulance for Ernest Hemingway. Get him
Yeah,
out.
you need some lotion. Get some lotion over here.
Oh god.
Yeah, I mean, if you watch any of his like life story, I mean, we were watching. I think Ken Burns did a documentary on Ernest Hemingway, and just like you're watching, I'm like, man, this guy sucked, man. Like this guy was a jerk. It's like I don't want to read any of his stuff anymore, and anything I read now is like tainted. Like, anyway, but yeah, I'm gonna go back and watch that episode. Of you guys.
Well, I guess we have come to the conclusion of the Garden of Forking Paths.
The Garden of Forking
And
Conversations.
I mean, I enjoyed the last part of the conversation. That was more interesting to me than honestly. Well, I mean, to be fair though, like everyone has said, this story is probably one of those that requires more than one reading. And this is the first time and that I've read this particular story, so perhaps there's a bit of unfairness in my take. And but otherwise, if our listeners have enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe and help us grow the channel, and we would appreciate that. So we can all not have to do our normal jobs ever again. All right. Anyway, take care, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye bye.